Now, let's talk a bit about how we get mutualisms. It's very clear from our studies in the current day, looking at mutualisms, that mutualisms virtually all originated as exploitation. One of the partners in the current mutualism originally sought out the other as a resource and damaged it. But it may have inadvertently provided a benefit of some kind from the interaction. So a pollinator today might have originated from a parasite previously that visited the plant to steal pollen. However, if that insect then visited a second plant and was a messy eater, it might have transferred pollen, allowing the plant to outcross. Well, that would be a tremendous advantage if it's difficult for your pollen to disperse in the forest. So that's an inadvertent benefit of primarily exploitative interaction. If there is a benefit like that, then any feature of the plant that maximizes the benefit and minimizes the harm will be rapidly selected for. Typically what happens in these mutualisms is that the original resource that was being exploited gets substituted for. So if insects were originally eating pollen, the plant provides nectar, which is kind of a really important thing because it's fuel for flight. And so that helps the pollinator move, and it also decreases the probability that the pollinator will just eat all the pollen in the plant. So the plant has to invest some energy, but on the other hand, it has to make less pollen because more of the pollen is transferred to other plants and less is eaten. Now, if that benefits the exploiter as well, then suddenly you've got a mutualism. And let's think about the pollination aspect. Flight is very energy expensive. If you can substitute nectar for pollen, you're providing those animals with fuel for flight. And so they can fly better, they can get more resources, they can find mates easier. So it's a mutual benefit now. And that turns an exploitative interaction into a mutualism. So here's the rationale in pollination, and there's actually a diversity of resources that have been substituted for pollen. So pollen is basically limiting to animals, and that's why animals would have sought out plants and their flowers to begin with to eat a protein-rich food. But the dispersal of pollen reduces inbreeding, increases outcrossing, and it raises the fitness of plants. So there's still some plants that allow insect visitors to eat their pollen. They just produce large quantities of pollen. But more often they substitute something else. Nectar is the one we think of. And it's mostly sugar, but there are also often amino acids in there to provide some protein subsidies for the pollinators, and that reduces their need for pollen even more. In other parts of the world, however, we're used to thinking of this in the temperate zone. In the tropics, there are other kinds of rewards that substitute for pollen, like resin. There are some flowers, such as Dalachampia, which is a tropical vine that I worked on in the mid-90s, that provides resin for nest construction. If you think about it, bees in particular make nests out of chewed up plant fibers. Well, what happens to that when it rains? Which it does in the tropics a lot. What happens to a sheet of paper in the rain? It melts away. So it would help if you could waterproof your nest. Resins get collected by tropical bees to waterproof their nests. A second thing that is really common is substituting an oily fragrance, which allows mates to find one another. And most orchid pollinating bees are collecting fragrances. They're not collecting pollen, and orchids do not provide nectar. So you'll see these beautiful bees in the rainforest visiting orchids and scraping up this smelly, oily stuff, and then they'll smear it on a stick. And these are all male bees. They're trying to attract females. And the females will come to the odor post and find a mate if they like the intensity of the scent. And what about dispersal? Well, seeds are also rich in protein, so the same rules apply to the initial interaction that was exploitative. But if some of the seeds get passed through the disperser accidentally, then they will get away from the parent plant and they'll have higher fitness. So anything that promotes that interaction will be rapidly selected for. So things like oak trees still produce enormous quantities of seeds and allow their dispersers to eat some. And in exchange, the dispersers will forget that some of those seeds exist. They'll put them in a safe place and then just forget about them, and then they'll germinate. But there are other kinds of rewards, like fleshy fruits, which is what, of course, we have exploited when we domesticated apples and peaches and things like that. And for ants, the equivalent is the elaiosome, which is the lipid and protein-rich, oily body that's attached to a seed. Okay, now you're asking about the energy-nutrient mutualisms. Well, they can be exploitative as well. The fungi in particular can steal resources from the plant without providing a benefit. And we think that that's how those originated. But we think that fungi that were leaky, basically, they absorbed nutrients from the soil and then their membranes were leaky and they leaked some into the plant. Those are the ones that the plants are cultivating. The others are simply parasites. Okay, so since mutualisms originated in exploitation, that suggests that there may be cheating involved occasionally, and that's certainly the case. So facultative mutualisms in particular, where there are loose groupings of organisms that gain a benefit but don't rely on each other, they're particularly vulnerable to cheating. And here's a couple of examples. So on the left here you see a bird-pollinated flower, and you see a bee chewing a hole in the base of the corolla of that flower, and it's going to stick its tongue in and get the nectar out. So it's cheating. It doesn't see these flowers that well, but when it finds them, it can exploit them. And it's not exploiting them in a way that benefits the plant at all. It's just stealing resources from the plant. Okay? And here is a second example. You see the bee chewing through the base of the corolla. It's going to stick its tongue in and get the nectar without providing pollination services. So how do plants deal with this? Well, they just try to have a very specific set of traits, and they may have tough protective bracts, which are petals or sepals that cover the base of the flower, and that prevents the bees from chewing through. So there's an example of cheating in facultative mutualisms on the part of bees. Here's cheating on the part of mutualisms with seed dispersers. Okay, so here are squirrels, and you've got them eating seeds, and here they're caching seeds for later. This one's storing them, this one's storing them, and they're going to save them for later. Well, the way that plants deal with this, I mean, they're producing enormous amounts of seeds to begin with. And they just produce that many more. And it saturates the predators. So they can still be dispersers and seed predators at the same time. On balance, it's a mutualism, because both species benefit more than they are harmed. Here's a protection mutualism that has some cheating. And here are some ants that you would think would nominally protect a plant but they're taking rewards and they're not protecting. So this ant is actually tending aphids. Now, aphids are parasites on plants. They suck the juices. And this ant is basically farming these aphids the way a chicken farmer would farm chickens. And here you have a different cheating mutualism. You have these ants, which are attracted to the extrafloral nectaries on this plant, and they are tending caterpillars. And the reason that they're being tended here is because these aphids produce a lot of dilute sugar solution because they're trying to filter out all the nitrogen in the plant sap. So they just excrete little droplets of sweet sap that we call honeydew. And these caterpillars are doing the same thing. And ants love that sweet little snack, so they basically cheat the plant. Well, plants can cut off the rewards. They can shut down their extrafloral nectaries. They can fail to provide domiciles and things like that. Now, we've been talking about animals cheating plants, but plants can cheat animals too. So here is an example in which plants are luring animal visitors, but they're not providing a reward. They're just cheating them by getting a service without providing a corresponding reward. This here on the left is not a wasp. It is a flower, and it looks like a wasp. And here is a male wasp attempting to mate with this flower. Now, why would the male wasp do something stupid like this? It's because the males come out of the ground where they've been developing before the females. So they can patrol areas where females might have been developing in the ground, looking for newly hatched females that are virgins, and they can be the first male to mate with her and get most of the eggs fertilized. So how do they find those females? The females put out an odor cue. Well, guess what the orchid does? It has something that looks approximately like a female wasp, and it uses the same odor cue that the female wasp does. So this poor male is trying to mate with something that he can't mate with, and in return for his efforts, he gets plastered with this pollinium, which is a sac of pollen that gets stuck to his head. If he goes and visits a second flower, that pollinium gets pulled off by a little hook here, pollinating the orchid. Now, the males don't have an option here. They have to find females, so they are vulnerable to this, especially naive males. Naive males visit 2 or 3 of these flowers before they figure it out. They figure out, that's not a female, even though it smells like one and kind of looks like one, so I'm not going back there. And so eventually they learn to avoid the orchids. However, in the meantime, they pollinated a couple of orchid plants. Orchids are notorious for this. So when a guy buys his date an orchid for a corsage, it's kind of a more sinister message than you might expect. Okay, so that's an ecological time. Let's look at how mutualism and exploitation can slip back and forth. Let's look first in evolutionary time. So this is the yucca moth and yucca interaction. Yuccas provide places for yucca moths to lay their eggs and eat some seeds as they develop, and in return, the adult moths fly around and pollinating the flowers. So that's a true mutualism. But what we can see is that some yucca moths don't pollinate yucca plants. They simply lay their eggs there. They don't visit the flowers and transfer pollen, and so they're parasites. So that's exploitation. Well, how does the balance work? Well, we can see that very clearly if we look at the phylogenies of these groups. So on the left, you have the phylogeny of the yuccas. And I'm sorry, this is On the left you have the phylogeny of the moths, and here on the right you have the genera and species of some of the moths. Okay, so here are here's the evolution of these groups of moths, and here's Graea. You're going to see that in another slide in just a second. Okay, but over here, this is where these moths that are basically seed predators, they lay their eggs in flowers and the larvae eat seeds. This is where they colonized things like yucca plants about 44 million years ago. So here's where they colonized yuccas specifically. Here's where they started pollinating. Okay, so you have then a bunch of genera that pollinate. And these guys, Tegaticula and Parateticula, they are true mutualists with the yuccas. Okay, as we go along though, you can see that eventually you get some cheating recurring. Now that's the same thing that was going on down here originally. Originally these were exploiters of seeds and they provided no pollination services. Here you have a group of cheaters. And here you have a second group of cheaters. But here you have closely related moths that are still true mutualists. So depending on ecological conditions, you may slip back and forth from mutualism to exploitation. This is a very cool system, but it doesn't help us understand what the ecological determinants are of whether you are on the mutualism side or the exploitation side. So we can see that by going back and looking at these Graea moths. And here's, in ecological time, some insights into how it slips back and forth from mutualism to exploitation. So here's a Graea moth, and it's on a little plant called Lithophragma. Okay, and it pollinates it, and it also eats the seeds, sometimes. All right, so here is Idaho, and here's Oregon, and here's Montana. So this is the northern Rocky Mountains, and this is an area where this Lithophragma plant grows, and where it is pollinated or visited by Graea moths. What you can see here, you got a bunch of dots, right? Notice that some of the dots are red, some of the dots are blue. Okay, so there's a difference here. What's the difference between the areas with red dots and the blue dots? The areas with red dots are high elevation, and Graea moths are the only pollinators. Because they are the only pollinators, that's the only way these plants can outcross. So they tolerate predation on their seeds by moth larvae. They, in fact, provide extra seeds for the larvae to eat. And they get that in exchange for pollination services. So at high elevation sites where you have the red dots, that's a mutualism. At low elevation spots like Spokane or Coeur d'Alene, or whatever this is here, this is Riggins, Idaho, which I know nothing about, and Pullman and Lewiston. These are all college towns, by the way, except for Riggins, which I think is a logging town. Those are low elevation sites. It so happens that there are other pollinators there. Lithophragma is visited not just by Graea, but by a bunch of other things. Those other things don't eat the seeds of this plant. So if you're the plant, you're asking yourself, well, I get pollination services from these other species. Why should I tolerate these moths eating my seeds? So what they do is they abort the seeds with larvae of the moths. So the pollinator is still pollinating, but the plant is now denying them a reward in return. They basically kill the larvae of these moths, although the moths are still pollinating them. And it's because even if the moth falls in density, they still have other pollinators to rely on, so they aren't hurt by that. So the plant does not bear the cost of the interaction if there's no reward, or if there's not enough reward. So this is an example of the plant having it both ways. Where it must have this thing as a mutualist, it provides extra seeds, and it's a mutualistic interaction. Where it doesn't have to have this, it kills the moths. It takes the pollination services and then kills the moths. And that's exploitation on the part of the plant. So, that concludes our discussion of two species interactions, and in the case of mutualism, sometimes multiple species interactions, and sets the stage for us to move on to talk about communities.